Hi, I'm Kelly Barnes, and I am with the PepsiCo Health and Nutrition Sciences team. And I have 10 years experience working for the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, conducting research on athletes, specifically around hydration and electrolyte balance. So I have conducted a lot of sweat tests, performed a lot of hydration strategy planning, and generally just done a lot of research, understanding what implications fluid loss can have on performance. And today I'm going to tell you about hydration and cognitive function and its influence on sports performance.
In this presentation, I'm going to start by defining athletes and commonalities and then categorizing certain athletes. Then I will move into describe hydration and how to determine hydration status and make hydration plans. And then I'll move into cognition and give definitions of cognition and how cognition is needed for athletes. And then I will actually talk about hydration and cognition together and how hydration levels can impact cognition. And then at the very end, I'll give some practical takeaways. All right, as I'm sure you all know, different athletes have different needs, but we also have commonalities between athletes. So we know that all athletes use and need fuel for energy to train and compete. They use muscles and need strength. They also sweat and need hydration. And performance can be impacted by suboptimal hydration in all athletes. Team sport athletes are unique because their training involves both physical and cognitive components. Their training includes many stop and go activities, and their environmental conditions, body size, and protective equipment vary between and even within team sports. And then endurance athletes are unique because they train and compete for long durations, typically 2 or more hours at a time, and often in hot and humid conditions. And specifically, they're usually runners, cyclists, or triathletes that compete in marathons, triathlons, and ultra endurance events. I'm going to start this presentation talking about hydration. Water is the largest component of the human body. In fact, water accounts for approximately 60% of body weight in the average adult. Body water plays an important role in numerous physiological processes. It functions as a solvent and provides a means of transportation of materials throughout the body. So what this means is that water is important for excretion of waste, blood volume and blood pressure regulation, transportation of oxygen and nutrients to the brain and exercising muscles, and water plays an important role in body temperature regulation by transferring heat out of the body. Improper hydration, such as dehydration, can have many consequences if severe. The lack of body fluid can increase the strain to athletes' heart and cardiovascular system. It can also increase the use and need for glycogen. And then there's ramifications to the metabolic and nervous system. And to make matters worse, dehydration can actually impair the athlete's ability to absorb and use the fluid that they take in. And of course, dehydration impairs thermal regulation and can put the athlete at higher risk for heat-related illnesses. There are two main things that affect an athlete's hydration: how much fluid they lose and how much they take in. And temperature, humidity, environment, training status all play a role in how well they maintain body water and how fast they might dehydrate during exercise. Beverage temperature, sweetness, and likability will also influence how much fluid they consume during exercise. To help maintain hydration, specific components of a rehydration beverage impact various steps in the hydration process. Obviously, the fluid that an athlete takes in will help replace fluid that they're losing. And then the carbohydrate in the beverage can actually help transport water from the gut into the blood. And then the sodium will not only help to distribute the fluid, but it will help the athlete retain the fluid that they're taking in so it's not just lost as urine. When an athlete exercises, heat is created within the body, usually within those working muscles, and sweating and the evaporation of the sweat from the skin surface is the primary mechanism by which the body cools itself. So sweating is actually quite important to prevent dangerous increases in body temperature. Now, sweating rates typically fall in the range of 1 to 2 liters per hour. And we found that in our internal research looking at almost 20 years of sweat data, that females on average typically have lower sweating rates, closer to about 0.9 liters per hour, and male sweating rates are slightly higher than that, maybe closer to 1.2 on average, and that's obviously across all different body sizes and ages and temperatures and sports. An individual sweating rate is determined mostly by genetics, but like I just said, the environment and exercise conditions also play heavily into that. And like I've just said in the last few slides, replacing these fluid losses is important to maintain hydration. And since sweating rate is so variable, it's important that athletes measure their individual sweating rate by measuring body weight change from before to after one exercise session. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that in the next slide. Like I've just said, we can help an athlete to understand their sweating rate by monitoring body weight changes before and after exercise. In a typical exercise session that lasts anywhere from 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours, the weight loss during exercise is going to be almost all from fluid loss. It's really impossible to lose body fat that quickly. So we can assume that 1 pound of lost weight is equal to about 16 ounces of fluid, or in kilograms and liters, it's 1 kilogram of lost weight or lost body weight is equal to 1 liter. So in order to estimate sweating rate in liters per hour, we add the weight lost and the fluid consumed during exercise divided by the duration of that exercise. It's really important that sweat tests are conducted in the environment where the athlete typically trains and competes. And it's important that any fluids that the athlete's going to be consuming during that sweat test are measured or weighed before and after consumption to be able to obtain the exact amount that was consumed. And we typically, wipe off any condensation from the outside of the bottles before we weigh them, as well as have the athlete towel dry any sweat that's on their body prior to any of the before or after weight measurements. And on the GSSI website, there's actually a fluid loss calculator that has a lot of extra instructions on how this can be accomplished, and actually the calculator itself shows you what you need to enter and the measurements that you need to take during a sweat test. And another reason that sweat rate calculations are important is because without understanding actual fluid losses and using maybe just thirst to gauge needs or consuming as much as you can during breaks can lead to excessive over or under drinking, both of which we believe should be avoided. Thus, a planned hydration strategy is typically recommended, and that involves knowing your sweating rate and drinking the fluid to prevent significant weight losses. Okay, so in summary, to measure how much fluid an athlete loses, sweating rate will need to be measured. And the steps are: obtain body mass before practice, know the mass of the food and fluid that are consumed during the practice or training session, know the mass of any urine or stool that's lost during this training session, obtain a post-exercise body mass after toweling dry, toweling that extra sweat off of the skin, and then know how long the training session lasted, meaning how long from the pre-exercise to post-exercise body mass. Okay, so once you've conducted a sweat test, then what? The next step is to develop a hydration strategy for your athlete. So we're going to take this example of an athlete that conducted a sweat test during a training and how to use that information to build a hydration plan. And in this example, we're going to use it for a marathon. So let's go through this example. We'll start by looking at the right-hand side of the screen at the sweat test. So the athlete's pre-exercise weight was 70 kilograms. Post-exercise weight was 69 kilograms. And this athlete took in 500 milliliters of fluid during his training session. So total sweat loss is 1.5 liters. And because I want to make the math easy on myself, I'm going to say that this exercise lasted for 90 minutes or an hour and a half. So the athlete lost 1.5 liters over the course of 1.5 hours. So his sweating rate is 1 liter per hour. It's going to be important to know the duration that the athlete is training in or competing in. So this athlete is training to run a 4-hour marathon. So I know if he runs for 4 hours, each of those hours he's going to lose 1 liter. So he's going to lose 4 liters of sweat over the course of that marathon, or approximately. Every hour might be slightly different pace. The temperature may change slightly, but if we use 4 liters as our estimate across the 4-hour marathon, we can figure out then drinking strategy. And now here's where things can get a little bit complicated, because we don't need this athlete to necessarily replace the entire amount of sweat fluid that he's losing, so that 1 liter every hour. We know that some athletes are going to be losing so much they won't be able to replace it. Those athletes that lose closer to that 2 liters per hour or more won't be able to consume that much fluid and certainly won't be able to absorb that much fluid. So we typically give our hydration strategy with a 2% body mass loss window. All right, so for this athlete, if we take the 4 liters that he'll be losing over the course of this marathon and subtract 2%, so 1.4 liters from that, we will want him to consume about 2.6 liters across the 4 hours to maintain adequate hydration. And I'm going to get a little bit more specific here, because for a lot of athletes, saying, all right, go out, drink 2.6 liters over the course of this 4 hours and you should be good, is still a little complex for them. So we typically break it up into smaller increments to let them know how much to drink per hour or per 20 minutes or per aid station. So for this athlete, we know that they need to consume 2.6 liters over 4 hours, which is approximately 650 milliliters every hour. And then breaking it down again, it's approximately 220 milliliters every 20 minutes. And if this athlete is passing maybe 2 aid stations every 20 minutes, then we'll recommend that he consume maybe at every other aid station he takes 2 cups. Because we typically know that cups at marathon aid stations are about 4 to 5 ounces. If he consumes 2 of them every 20 minutes, he's going to be consuming around 8 ounces of fluid every 20 minutes, which is approximately that 220 milliliters, which will keep him at that adequate hydration. Now, there's something else that can make this more complicated. For instance, a lot of big marathons are held in the spring, like the Boston Marathon, or in the fall, like the New York Marathon or the Chicago Marathon. And a lot of times the weather during those times is quite unpredictable. So this athlete may have prepared for a race that's going to be a cool climate, and it turns out that the race conditions are going to be actually quite hot. So we do recommend that athletes understand sweating losses in multiple different training intensities and climates so that they can adjust their hydration strategy if things change last minute. And for those individuals that work with athletes in different sports, this could be of interest to you because we've done some work, again, with those that data from sweat tests across almost 20 years, we looked at how the sweat profiles, so sweat sodium loss and sweating rate, vary by sport. And you can see here on the left, we're looking at sweat sodium loss. And we found that endurance athletes and American football players lose more sodium than many of the other sports. But what's even more interesting, I think, is that the sweat sodium losses are quite variable. And if you look, you can see some of the variability within some of the sports, specifically endurance and American football. And then you can see that there's quite a few outliers in all of the sports. And if you look specifically at football, you can see some of those athletes are losing really high amounts of sodium per hour. And that's in milligrams per hour. And then moving on to the right side of the screen, when we're looking at the sweat fluid loss by sports, we're still seeing endurance athletes and American football players losing more fluid than the other sports, which is interesting because endurance athletes tend to be smaller stature than some of the other sports like basketball. And a lot of our research has shown that body mass is a large component of sweating rate, and typically larger athletes sweat more than smaller athletes. But again, in the sweating rate is highly variable, and you can see that in all of these sports, specifically the sports that are played outdoors in changing environmental conditions, like American football or endurance. And you can see again, endurance athletes and American football have quite high outliers. So some of these athletes are losing quite a bit of fluid per hour. What's even more interesting, and I'm going to go into a little bit further, is how one individual's sweat profile, their sweat electrolyte losses and their sweating rate, can change as they change exercise intensity and across their seasons. So if they're training in hotter climates versus cooler climates. Okay, so I'm going to give you a case study where I took one athlete and we did sweat tests on this athlete multiple times. So they exercised in 3 different environments. So a hot environment, a warm environment, and a cool environment. And they did 2 exercise intensities at each environment. So we actually have 6 sweat profiles on this athlete, and I want to show you how those look. Okay, as I mentioned, there's considerable variability in sweat profiles within an athlete across the training season. And this shows step by step how weather and intensity can affect sweating rates of an athlete. If we start on the left side with the cooler climates, you can see on the very bottom there's a key that shows that the left bars are for cool climate, the middle bars are for like a moderate climate, and then the bars on the right, or which will be located on the right, are for a hot climate. So starting on the left with the cool climate, if you see the low intensity exercise, this athlete is losing about 1 liter of sweat fluid per hour. And then in that same climate, just by increasing his intensity, he's losing 1.6 liters per hour. So he loses 0.6 liters per hour more with higher intensity in the same exact environmental condition. And then moving into the moderate climate, or whether that is warm, you can see that the athlete is losing more now in the low intensity exercise than when it was a cool climate. So 1.3 liters versus that 1 liter per hour. And then if I show you how his sweat changes when I increase the exercise intensity in the same warm environment, he's now losing 1.9 liters an hour. So that's obviously more than the low intensity, as well as more than he was losing in the cool climates. And then as expected, when we move into the hot climate or hot weather, you can see that the low intensity sweating rate is higher than it was in the low intensity for the warm climate, and it's actually almost as high as the high intensity cool climate, but then obviously higher than the low intensity cool climate. And then if we also show the high intensity in this hot climate, you can see that it's the highest out of all of the situations. And if I take the differences between the lowest sweating rate that we measured at the low intensity cool climate and the highest sweating rate that we measured at the high intensity hot climate, you can see what the difference is going to be. So in the low intensity cool climate, this athlete lost about 1 liter of sweat fluid an hour. And at the high intensity hot climate, they lost about 2.2 liters of sweat fluid per hour, which is a difference of 1.2 liters per hour. And so if this athlete had measured their sweating rate at maybe they measured it in the summer at the hot climate and it was during one of their harder exercises, and then they competed, they made their hydration strategy off of that sweat test, and then they competed in a cool climate, maybe in the fall or winter, and their competitions was slightly lower than the intensity that they used for their test. You can see they'd be over consuming 1.2 liters every hour. And if this is a 3-hour event, then that's a difference of 3.6 liters. So not only do athletes need to know their sweat profile, they need to know multiple sweat profiles if they're going to be training or competing in different exercise intensities or different climates. And then if we move on to sweat sodium, this slide is going to show the combination of sweat fluid loss and sweat sodium concentration to give us the sweat sodium loss. And it's going to follow a very similar pattern that the sweating rate did, and it's set up exactly the same. So we have the cool conditions on the left, the middle is that warm or moderate conditions, and then on the right-hand side, it's the hot conditions. And if we start again on the left-hand side, the cool climate, the low intensity, the sweat sodium losses are just over 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And then as we increase the exercise intensity at that same cool climate, the sweat sodium losses increase again, exactly like the sweat fluid losses. And then exactly as expected, when we go to the center bars for the moderate climate, the low intensity exercise sweat sodium loss is more than it was for the cool climate, low intensity exercise, and then moving into higher intensity exercise or more demanding exercise, this athlete is losing more sodium than in the low intensity and than in the cool climate. And then lastly, when we move to the hot climate, when this athlete exercises at a lower intensity in the hot climate, they're losing more than they would at any other low intensity and almost as much as they would lose at the high intensity cool climate. And then obviously as they move up in intensity, their exercise gets more challenging. They are losing more sodium, and obviously they're losing the most amount of sodium out of any of the other conditions. Again, the trend follows the sweating rate quite closely. And again, if we take that extreme difference, the sweat sodium loss at the low exercise intensity in a cool climate versus the high exercise intensity at a hot climate, we're going to see that the difference is a little more than 3,000 milligrams of sodium. And again, if this athlete was doing that same thing, if it was the same athlete that did the sweat test in the high intensity hot climate but was competing at the low intensity cool climate, and they were competing over 3 hours, they'd be potentially over consuming 9,000 milligrams of sodium for that event, which just further shows how important it can be to understand sweat losses so that replacements are appropriate. Beyond the health benefits of proper hydration and ensuring that you are not drinking too much or too little, There are also performance ramifications to dehydration for many athletes. This specific graph shows the amount of research studies that have shown performance decrements with increasing degrees of dehydration. As you can see, endurance sports are more affected than strength and power sports, and typically, the more dehydrated, the greater chance of performance decrements. And on this graph, you can also see that 2% body mass loss during exercise is generally the threshold of when performance is impacted. And you can see that there are over half of the studies, 14 out of 16, found performance decrements even at just that 2% body mass loss. But this also shows that at lower levels of dehydration, like 2 to 3% body mass loss, there are some athletes that can tolerate slightly greater losses without impairing performance, but there are some that can only tolerate less than that. So this is why it's often advised that each athlete practice their hydration strategy to understand what is tolerable. Most of this presentation has been focused on that during occasion, how athletes should replace the fluid that they're losing during exercise. But athletes should also replace fluid after they've stopped exercising. And typically, if they're unable to consume fluid during exercise, they'll need to consume what they lost plus an additional amount of fluid, which is about 20 to 24 ounces per pound body mass loss during exercise, or about 1.5 liters per kilogram lost. And that's to account for continued sweating and urination after exercise has stopped. To summarize our hydration section, athletes should practice hydration strategies. They should understand their losses and understand how much fluid loss they can tolerate, and understand how to take in fluid to minimize losses. But they should expect to lose some weight during exercise, and that's completely normal. However, they should try to drink enough fluid during or throughout the exercise to maintain body weight change within about 2% for hot conditions. And they can go a little further, maybe like 3% for cooler conditions when possible. However, we know that sweat losses vary between and within sports, so we need to know what those losses are and possibly how they change throughout a season. We do not want to recommend any athletes overdrink. And then the beverages should include some sodium to improve palatability and to stimulate drinking and retain fluid. And the focus for sodium should be definitely on exercises that are greater than 2 hours, or if the sodium losses are quite high. And then on daily intake, throughout the day, every day, athletes and the general population should drink gradually and avoid drinking too much too quickly. Okay, now that we've covered the basics of hydration, we're going to change gears and focus on cognition now. So what is cognition? In the most basic sense, cognition is the process the mind uses to take in, transform, and use information. Essentially, it's how we use the information we get to make sense of it and apply it where and when necessary. To assess cognitive performance, scientists have developed tests for specific cognitive domains in question, and I'll explain cognitive domains a little bit in the next slide. And these tests are important to our understanding of how hypohydration or dehydration may affect cognitive performance by providing insights into which aspects are most likely to be affected by fluid deficits. Now, the tests need to be sensitive to differences between subjects, but also to differences between states within one individual. There are many cognitive domains, and they're on a continuum of what is considered lower order or least complex to higher order or more complex. And this is just a list of some of the more often used or more often talked about cognitive domains. And things like using our senses are often lower order, and memory or executive function and processing speed and language skills are more complex or higher order domains. And this means you use more mental processes for those higher order domains, and they just require more brain power. There are many cognitive domains that are important for sports. Here are some quick examples: the ability to learn plays, the ability to remember plays, sensation and perceptions to react to the sound of a whistle or a buzzer. Vigilance to understand what is happening within a play. Executive function to problem solve against the defense. Language skills to communicate with teammates. Motor skills to execute sport-specific tasks like shooting or dribbling or passing. Reaction time, as well as coordination and balance. Here's a real-world example of some of these domains, and I've used basketball as an example. So basketball players use many cognitive domains. They use sensation and perception to recognize the presence of whistles or buzzers, or to feel pressure in which to exert force to the ball for dribbling, passing, and shooting. They use motor control to execute sport-specific tasks, like keeping control over the ball when dribbling, or aiming and applying the right force and direction to the ball when shooting. They use language skills to comprehend teammates' calls and to understand plays being called. Long-term memory is required to determine how to perform all of the components of the sport. Then lastly, they need executive function, which is comprised of a combination of other domains to maintain focus on components of a play throughout the duration of the play, and to maintain focus on only the most relevant information required for the sport task. Then lastly, they need executive function, which is comprised of combinations of other domains. For example, they need sustained attention to maintain focus on components of a play throughout the duration of the play. And they need selective attention to maintain focus on only the most relevant information required for the sport task. Then they also use working memory to ensure that they are aware of the information around them regarding nearby players and other obstacles. And then cognitive flexibility to adapt their speed and spacing around those obstacles or other players while continuing to adapt to the changing moves of the opponents. And obviously, like I said, cognition is necessary for pretty much all sports. So here's some other examples, shorter examples of cognition in different sports. If we take endurance exercise, we can use endurance cycling, and I can show you that motor skills and procedural memory are necessary to remember how to ride a bike and how to stay balanced on that bike. And then endurance cyclists need perspective memory to remember to take what amount and what type of nutrition during a multi-hour long training or competition. Exactly like I was explaining with the hydration strategy, they need to know how much they should be taking at which time points. And then American football needs selective attention to execute specific plays and processing speed for the quarterback to determine where to throw the ball before being sacked. And then obviously language skills are very important again to be able to hear and interpret plays that are being called. And then the last example I'll give is golf. Executive function is necessary to get the ball out of a situation that you did not plan for. Procedural memory is necessary to remember how to swing the club optimally. And then perception is needed to determine how hard to swing the club for the distance the ball needs to go. And these are just a few examples, but cognition is necessary for all walks of life and is certainly necessary for all sports. And the last section that we'll get to in this presentation is hydration and cognition. And in this section, we'll talk mostly about the ramifications to cognition when hydration is less than optimal. In this section, I'm going to expand upon what I am terming cognition or team sport performance. And I'm going to tell you that team sport performance involves cognition, like I've just described in the previous section, but it also involves skill. So shooting, passing, dribbling, which are components of cognition via motor skills or motor action, but slightly different. And then physical performance as well. So things like sport-specific lateral movements, sprints, jumping, just to name a few. And then fatigue, so ratings of perceived exertion and fatigue as well. We'll all kind of group that in as team sport performance. And studies have shown that with increased levels of dehydration, so that maybe 3 to 4% body mass loss, team sport performance can be impacted. And I'm showing you this study on the right. That's just one example, and it's a simulated basketball game. And as you can see, it's a really good picture description of how with increased levels of dehydration, the players took longer to complete the drills. And you can see the 1% dehydration is not different than the baseline really. And then as dehydration progresses to 3 and definitely at 4%, the amount of performance decrement is significantly different than baseline. And then when heat stress is combined with dehydration, the impairment can be worsened. And this is just an animation that I hope just further gets at the point of how dehydration can impact, in this situation, players' speed. In general, team sport athletes are at risk of training and competing in a hypohydrated state when fluid losses are large and or there are challenges with fluid availability or opportunities to drink. Their cognitive, skill, and physical performance may be impaired with hypohydration or dehydration, especially when combined with heat stress, like I've just mentioned. And the decrements in cognitive function, skill, and physical performance in team sports are more likely to occur when the hypohydration levels are greater than about 2% body mass loss, like I've said before. But there is significant inter-individual variability in the effect of hypohydration or dehydration on team sport performance. Additionally, their RPE, or the ratings of perceived exertion, or how hard they feel they are working, and their fatigue is often worsened with dehydration. And you can see these pie charts from an article that we published at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute represents the percentage of research studies that have found worsened performance when athletes had at least 2% body mass loss. And you can see the amount of studies done per sport indicated on the right-hand side of each of the pie charts. And then in gray, it shows the percentage of studies that found decrements. So as you can see for cognition, 71% of studies found decrements to their cognitive performance when there was at least 2% dehydration. And then for their skills, like those specific skills like shooting or passing or dribbling, you can see that 46% of studies found decrements to their skills when there was at least 2% dehydration. And then if we look at the physical performance, those sport-specific lateral movements or sprinting, jumping, power, or high-intensity running, there's 57% of the studies found decrements. And then the RPE and fatigue, the vast majority of the studies, 92% found decrements when there's at least 2% dehydration. So there does seem to be an effect of hydration on team sport performance. And if we break that down a little bit further into the method of hypohydration and then by body mass loss, we can understand it a little bit better. So when we look at the number of studies or the percentage of studies that reported impaired team sport performance, half of them were reported with passive heat. So when it was not combined with exercise, so just heat in general, and those are cognitive tests. And then with just exercise, so no heat involved, there's a slightly less percentage, so 6 out of 22 studies found decrements in performance with just exercise for their dehydration method. And then when you combine exercise and heat, again, it's the vast majority of the studies are finding decrements to performance when there's exercise, so sweating from exercise and from heat stress. And then when we look at body mass loss, you can see that at lower body mass losses, so 1 to 2%, only about half of the studies, slightly less than half of the studies, are finding decrements, but at higher levels, like 3 to 4%, all of the studies are finding team sport performance decrements. So you can see from this slide and the slide before that there's definitely an impact, but how many athletes are being impacted and how the athletes are being impacted is going to make it, it's going to be different between the performance measures, so cognition, skill, physical performance, and fatigue, as well as the methods of hypohydration and how much hypohydration they're reaching. However, we still don't know quite why this is. There's been a few studies that suggest that dehydration could cause physiological events that impact the brain's function, such as a decreased blood flow, decreased brain volume, or an increase in the blood-brain barrier permeability. Or there's some studies that suggest that it simply may be psychological distractions that are caused by the symptoms of dehydration, such as thirst, headache, fatigue, or negative mood. Likely, it's a combination of both the physiological and the psychological mechanisms. So to summarize, there's large variability in the amount of sweat fluid team sport athletes lose, both within and between sports. And the effect of hydration status on team sport performance has been mixed. Some have found decrements, while others have found no performance impairment. And hydration is more likely to impair cognition, technical skill, and physical performance at higher levels of body mass loss, especially when it's combined with heat stress. So what does this all mean to practitioners? So in general, athletes and practitioners should strive to understand individual fluid losses during team sport play and provide customized hydration replacement plans. So similar to that example I gave for the marathon runner. When cognitive domains are critical, athletes should keep sweat losses in those lower ranges, so the 1 to 2% body mass loss, especially when environmental conditions are hot and humid. And to do this, athletes should be given access to fluid and ample opportunities to drink. And that image on the right just shows a Venn diagram of the likelihood of performance impairment with hypohydration, and if the conditions are hot and there's other factors like high aerobic demand, baseline dehydration, or other things, then combined with the dehydration of greater than 2% body mass loss, then performance decrements are highly likely.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I hope that now you have a better understanding of hydration and how suboptimal hydration can affect sport, as well as how to measure hydration and fluid losses and electrolyte losses during exercise, as well as how to create hydration strategies to prevent some of those fluid losses during exercise, as well as a basic understanding now of cognition and how cognition plays into sport and sport performance, and how hydration, especially suboptimal hydration levels, can affect athletic performance. And again, I thank you for your time and attention.